A Hell's Angel rode down an empty trail. It led him to a mother and her children, abandoned by their stepfather. The house was quiet at 4 in the morning, the way Deacon liked it. No radios, no voices, just the tick of the old clock on the kitchen wall and the soft groan of floorboards under his boots. He had lived alone outside town for 6 years now, in a small house with a big yard and a metal shed out back, where he kept the only thing in his life that never asked him for anything he couldn't give. He filled the coffee pot with water from the tap, his hands moving through the motions without needing his eyes. 3 scoops of grounds. Black, no sugar. Mikey used to tease him about that, said only sad old men drank their coffee black. Deacon had been drinking it black since he was 19. While the coffee brewed, he stood at the window and watched the dark start to thin out at the edges, the sky turning that deep blue color that wasn't quite morning yet, but wasn't night anymore either. This was his favorite part of the day. Nobody wanted anything from him. Nobody needed him to be the sergeant-at-arms, the man who kept the peace, the one who made hard calls when hard calls needed making. Out here, before the sun came up, he was just Deacon, just a man with coffee and quiet. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. He poured the coffee into a thermos, screwed the lid on tight, and carried it out to the shed. The motorcycle sat under a canvas cover, and he pulled the cover back slow, like he was uncovering something sacred. In a way, he was. It was a black and chrome machine, older now, but he kept it running clean. He crouched down and checked the tires first, pressing his thumb against the rubber. Then he checked the oil, the chain, the brake lines. It was a ritual he could do blindfolded, but he never rushed it. Mikey had taught him that. Take care of the bike, and the bike takes care of you. He remembered being 22, riding beside his brother down a stretch of highway with the windows of the world wide open. No helmet laws enforced out where they grew up, just wind and engine noise, and Mikey's laugh carrying back to him over his shoulder. Mikey had been 2 years younger, but rode like he owned the road, leaning into curves like he was daring gravity to try something. Deacon used to yell at him to slow down. Mikey never did. There was another memory, sharper this time. The two of them parked on the ridge above Miller's Creek, engines ticking as they cooled, sharing a warm beer because that was all they'd thought to bring. Mikey had looked out over the trees and said, "Someday I want to build something out here. A cabin, maybe. Something that's ours." Deacon hadn't taken him seriously back then. They were young, and everything felt like it had all the time in the world attached to it. He didn't have all the time in the world. None of them did. Mikey had been gone 3 years now, taken sudden and cruel by a heart that gave out on him while he slept. No warning, no goodbye. Deacon still remembered the phone call. He remembered how the whole world had gone silent and far away, like he was underwater. He stood up from the bike and rubbed the back of his neck, pushing the memory back down where it belonged. He'd learned how to carry grief without letting it show. You didn't survive in his world by falling apart in front of people. You survived by getting up every day and doing what needed doing. Once a month, he did this. He rode the trail he and Mikey used to ride together, out past the old logging roads, deep into the quiet where the trees swallowed the sound of the engine, and there was nothing but him and the memory of his brother. He never told anyone why he did it. Tank and Whistler knew better than to ask. Deacon swung his leg over the bike and settled into the seat, the leather worn soft in the shape of his body after all these years. He pulled his gloves on, one finger at a time, and checked the sky one more time. Clear. Good light for the ride. He kicked the engine to life, and the sound rolled out across the yard and into the trees, familiar and steady as a heartbeat. He pulled out of the shed and onto the gravel road, the last clean light of morning stretching gold across the fields, and pointed the bike toward the trailhead, same as he did every month, without fail. The trail swallowed him whole the way it always did, the trees closing overhead like a green tunnel, sunlight breaking through in scattered coins that danced across the dirt path. Deacon eased off the throttle as the ground grew rougher, ruts and roots pushing up through the packed earth. This was the part of the ride where the world went quiet in a different way. Not silent. Alive. Birds calling somewhere up in the branches, the creek running somewhere off to his left, hidden but always there, always talking to itself. He thought about Mikey the way he always did on this stretch. Right about here was where his brother used to stand up on the pegs, arms loose, laughing like the whole forest belonged to him. Deacon could still see it if he closed his eyes too long. Mikey's jacket flapping, his head tipped back, hollering something about how a man could disappear out here and nobody would ever find him. And wouldn't that be something? Turned out Mikey had disappeared anyway, just not the way either of them ever imagined. Deacon rolled the throttle steady, keeping his speed slow and even, the way he always did once the trail narrowed. This was sacred ground to him, even if nobody else in the world understood why. A stretch of dirt and trees that most people would drive past without a second look. To Deacon, it was a graveyard and a chapel all rolled into one. The trail bent hard to the left, curving around a stand of thick pines that blocked the view until you were almost on top of it. Deacon leaned into the turn out of habit, easy and practiced. Then he saw it. His boot hit the brake before his mind caught up to what his eyes were telling him. The bike shuddered to a stop, gravel crunching under the tires, and Deacon sat there for a second, just staring. A minivan. Sitting crooked across the trail, nose angled into the brush like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The driver's door hung open, swaying slightly like something had bumped it and left it there. No engine running. No sound at all except the wind moving through the branches overhead. Deacon's stomach twisted into a tight knot. This trail didn't lead anywhere. Not really. It wasn't a road people used to get somewhere else. It dead-ended a couple miles up, back where the old logging camps used to be, back where nobody came anymore except hunters in the fall, and Deacon himself, once a month, alone. He killed his engine. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. He climbed off slow, boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud, and walked toward the van with his eyes moving fast, taking in every detail. The tires looked fine. No damage on the front end, no sign of a wreck. Just parked wrong, crooked, careless, like whoever left it hadn't cared how it looked. Then he saw the shoe. It was small. A little sneaker. Pink with some kind of cartoon character stitched onto the side, lying on its side in the mud a few feet from the open door. A kid's shoe. Just sitting there like it had fallen off and nobody had bothered to pick it up. Deacon's jaw tightened. He crouched down next to it, not touching it yet, just looking. The mud around it was churned up, like there had been some kind of scramble here. Small footprints, a child's, mixed in with a woman's boot prints, all moving away from the van and off toward the trees. He stood up slow, scanning the tree line, feeling that old instinct kick in, the one that had kept him alive through worse nights than this. Something was wrong here, wrong in a way that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He followed the footprints with his eyes first, tracing them from the mud near the van toward a gap in the brush, where the ground dipped down into a shallow ravine. And past that, Half hidden behind a curtain of overgrown branches, he saw the shape of something wooden and slouched with age. A cabin. Deacon's chest tightened. He knew this cabin, or thought he did. Some half-buried memory from a boyhood hunting trip, him and Mikey trailing behind their old man, this exact same crooked roofline cutting through the trees. He didn't waste any more time standing there. He started walking, following the small footprints pressed into the soft ground, moving toward the cabin with his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin looked worse the closer he got. Half the porch had rotted through, boards sagging like old teeth. Moss climbed up one whole side of it, and the window glass was so grimy he couldn't see anything through it except shadows. But there were shadows moving, and there were voices. Small and shaky, but voices. Deacon slowed his steps, easing his boots down soft on the packed dirt so he wouldn't spook whoever was inside. He could hear a woman's voice now, low and trying hard to sound calm, the kind of voice a mother uses when she's scared but doesn't want her kids to know it. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. Mommy's right here." A kid sniffled. Another one coughed, a wet, tired sound. Deacon stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He was a big man, 6'2" of leather and muscle and years of hard living, and he knew what he looked like to strangers. He knew what his beard and his tattoos and his cut said to people who didn't know him. Fear was usually the first thing he saw on people's faces. He didn't want to scare them worse than they already were. But there wasn't a version of this where a man his size showed up quiet and didn't scare somebody. He climbed the steps slow, careful about which boards he trusted his weight to, and knocked twice on the door frame since the door itself was hanging half open already. "Hello?" he called out, keeping his voice low and even. "Anybody in there? I saw the van on the trail." The voices inside went dead silent. He pushed the door open the rest of the way, slow, giving them time to see him coming instead of springing on them. The inside of the cabin was dim, lit only by the weak orange glow of a fire that looked like it was one breath away from dying out completely. And huddled around that fire, pressed together on a moth-eaten blanket, was a woman and 2 kids. The woman had her arms wrapped around both children, pulling them into her sides like she could shield them with her own body if she had to. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and streaked with dirt, and her eyes when they landed on Deacon went wide with a fear so raw it hit him like a fist to the chest. The little girl, maybe 7 or 8, buried her face into her mother's shoulder. The boy, younger, maybe 5, just stared at Deacon with big, round eyes, his small body shaking, whether from cold or fear or both. "Stay back," the woman said, her voice cracking even as she tried to make it hard. Her hand shot out toward the fireplace, fingers wrapping around a rusted old poker leaning against the stone. "I mean it. Stay back." Deacon stopped in the doorway. He lifted both his hands slow, palms open, showing her he wasn't holding anything, wasn't reaching for anything. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice as gentle as he could make it. "Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you. My name's Deacon. I was riding the trail and saw your van sitting empty. Followed the footprints here because I wanted to make sure everybody was okay." The woman's arm trembled, the poker wavering in her grip. Her eyes darted from his face down to his leather cut, to the patches and the emblem, and Deacon watched something in her expression shift, calculating, trying to decide if he was one more danger on top of whatever danger had already brought her out here. "Please," Deacon said. "I know how I look. I know this ain't easy to trust. But you and your kids look like you need help, and I'm not going to leave without knowing you're safe." For a long moment, nobody moved. The fire popped weakly, sending up a thin curl of smoke. The little boy's teeth were chattering now, loud enough to hear. Then something in the woman seemed to break. Her shoulders dropped. The poker slipped from her fingers, clattering against the stone hearth, and she pressed a trembling hand over her mouth like she was trying to hold in a sob that had been building for 3 days straight. "He left us," she said, her voice shaking apart at the edges. "My husband. He said he was going into town for supplies. That was 3 days ago. He never came back." Deacon didn't waste another second on words. He turned and moved fast, back out the door and down the rotten porch steps, boots hitting the dirt hard as he jogged to where his Harley sat parked at the edge of the trail. His saddlebags were packed the way they always were, full of things a man learns to carry after enough years on the road. He unbuckled the first bag and pulled out a thermal blanket, silver, and folded tight into a square no bigger than a paperback book. From the other bag, he grabbed a bag of trail mix, 2 protein bars, and a bottle of water. Then his lighter, a heavy steel one that never failed him no matter the weather. He carried it all back inside, moving quick but careful, not wanting to startle them again. "Here," he said, kneeling by the fire pit. "Let's get this going first. Kids need heat more than anything right now." The woman watched him with cautious eyes, but she didn't stop him. He reached for the small pile of half-burned wood scraps sitting nearby, useless and damp, and pulled a handful of dry pine needles and bark curls from his jacket pocket, the kind of tinder a man learns to always keep on him. He built it up careful, blowing soft and steady until a real flame caught, and started climbing. The warmth hit the room almost right away, and Deacon heard the little boy let out a shaky breath, like his body had been waiting for permission to relax. "Here," Deacon said again, unfolding the thermal blanket and holding it out toward the woman. "Wrap them up in this. It'll hold heat better than what you got." She took it with trembling hands and pulled it around both kids, tucking it snug over their shoulders. The little girl peeked out from the blanket edge, her eyes still wary but curious now too. "When's the last time they ate?" Deacon asked, keeping his voice low and even. The woman swallowed hard. "Yesterday morning. We had some crackers left. That's gone now." Her voice cracked on the last word. Deacon's jaw tightened, but he kept his face calm for the kids' sake. He tore open the protein bars and handed them over, one for each kid, then passed the trail mix to the woman. "Water?" he asked. "We've been melting snow," she said. "It's not much." "How long you been out here total?" 3 days, she said. "He left the second morning. Said he was going for supplies." Her hands shook as she opened the water bottle and gave the kids small sips. "My phone's dead. There's no signal out here anyway. I didn't know what else to do." Deacon watched the little boy tear into the protein bar like he hadn't eaten in a week, and something in his chest went tight and hot all at once. 3 days. No food, barely any water, a fire that had almost died out completely, and 2 kids who couldn't have been older than 8 and 5, sitting in the cold, waiting for a father who wasn't coming back. "You did right," Deacon said. "You kept them alive. That's not nothing." The woman's eyes glistened, but she nodded, tucking the blanket tighter around her children. Deacon watched a few more minutes as the kids ate, color slowly coming back into their cheeks, the fire crackling steady and strong now, throwing real heat into the room. Once he was sure they were stable, he stood. "I'm going to step outside a minute," he said. "Get some help coming. I'll be right on the porch. You'll hear me the whole time." The woman nodded, clutching her kids close, watching him with an expression that was somewhere between relief and disbelief. Deacon walked back out into the cold, pulling the door shut behind him just enough to keep the heat in. He crossed to his bike and grabbed the CB radio clipped near the handlebars, keying the mic. "Tank, Whistler, you copy?" he said, voice low and urgent. "This is Deacon. I need you out here now." Static crackled before Tank's gravel voice came through. "Go ahead." "I'm out on the old logging trail, Miller's Creek. Found a family stuck out here. No food, no heat. Kids look bad. I need blankets, groceries, water, a generator if we got one. Bring it all! Now!" An hour later, the sound reached them first. A low rumble that grew and grew until it filled the whole valley, bouncing off the trees like thunder that never stopped rolling. Emily sat up straight, pulling Sophie and Tucker closer against her on the cabin floor. Her heart hammered. She looked at Deacon, who was crouched by the fire, and saw him rise slow and easy, not a bit worried. "That's them," he said. She wasn't ready for what walked through the door. 4 men, each one bigger than the last, filled the small cabin doorway like a wall of leather and denim. Tattoos covered their arms, faces rough with beards and years of hard living. One of them, the biggest, had a skull patch on his vest and a chain hanging from his belt. Emily's arms tightened around her children instinctively, her body remembering every warning she'd ever heard about men who looked like this. "Easy," Deacon said, catching her look. "These are my brothers. Tank, Whistler. They're here to help." The biggest one, Tank, ducked his head under the doorframe and set down 2 grocery bags, heavy enough to make his arms bulge. He looked at Sophie and Tucker peeking out from the blanket, and his whole face changed. The hard lines around his mouth softened into something almost shy. "Hey there," he said, voice like gravel but gentle. "Y'all like grilled cheese?" Tucker's eyes went wide. He nodded before he could stop himself. Whistler came in behind Tank, carrying a portable generator under one arm like it weighed nothing. 2 more bikers followed, arms loaded with blankets, a cooler, and a big red first aid kit. They moved around the cabin with the kind of quick, practiced motion of men used to setting up camp fast. No wasted movement, no words needed between them. Within minutes, the generator was rumbling outside the window, and a string of small work lights clicked on, filling the dim cabin with warm yellow light. One of the other bikers, a quiet man with a gray ponytail, knelt by the old wood stove and got a proper fire going, feeding it real logs instead of scraps. Tank set up a camp stove on the small kitchen counter, cracking eggs into a pan like he'd done it 1,000 times. The smell of butter and toast started filling the cabin, and Emily watched Sophie's nose twitch as she leaned toward the sound and the smell, some of the fear finally draining out of her small shoulders. "You got a good fire going here already," Whistler said to Deacon, nodding at the stove. "Nice work." "Wasn't me who kept them alive 3 days," Deacon said, glancing at Emily. "That was her." Emily felt her face go hot. She wasn't used to praise, especially not from strangers, especially not from men who looked like they could crush a car with their bare hands. Tank brought over 2 plates, grilled cheese cut into triangles, a small pile of scrambled eggs beside each one. He set them down in front of Sophie and Tucker so carefully, like they were made of glass. "Careful, it's hot," he said. And then, softer, almost embarrassed, "You kids doing okay?" Sophie looked up at him, still wary, but she nodded. Tucker didn't wait for permission. He grabbed a triangle of grilled cheese with both hands and took a huge bite, cheese stretching from his mouth to the plate. A small sound of pure happiness escaped him, and for the first time in 3 days, Emily heard her son laugh. It cracked something open in her chest. She watched as the men worked around her family, careful and quiet, tucking blankets tighter around the kids' shoulders, checking the fire, making sure the generator ran smooth. None of them asked her for anything. None of them looked at her the way Russell used to, like she owed him something just for existing. By the time full dark settled outside the cabin windows, the whole place had changed. Warm light glowed steady from the work lamps. The stove hummed with the smell of coffee now, rich and dark. Sophie had stopped shivering, her cheeks pink from the fire's heat, and she was even smiling a little as Tucker showed her his empty plate, proud like he'd won a prize. Emily sat back against the wall, wrapped in a blanket Tank had handed her without a word, and watched these rough, tattooed strangers fill her children's bellies and warm the room with a gentleness she hadn't expected from anyone in a very long time. Morning light came through the cabin windows, soft and gray, and the smell of coffee still hung in the air from the night before. Emily woke stiff on the floor, Sophie curled against one side of her and Tucker against the other, both of them still fast asleep. For a moment, just a moment, she forgot where she was. Then the cold floor under her hip reminded her. Deacon was already up, crouched by the generator outside the open cabin door, a cup of black coffee steaming in his hand. When he saw her stir, he nodded toward a small cord snaking in through the window. "Hooked your phone up to the generator a while ago," he said. "Should have some charge on it now." Emily sat up slow, careful not to wake the kids, and crawled over to where her phone lay on the windowsill, the little cord running down to a battery pack Tank had rigged up. The screen was dark, but when she picked it up, a faint light blinked in the corner. She pressed the button. Nothing. She pressed it again, holding it down. The screen flickered, then came alive. And it did not stop. Notification after notification stacked up on the screen, one after another, a flood of buzzing and dinging that made Tucker stir behind her, bank alerts, missed calls, voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize, a text message thread from a collections agency asking about a payment that was 3 days late. Then another. Then another. Emily's stomach turned cold. "What is it?" Deacon asked, his voice low, watching her face change. She didn't answer right away. Her thumb moved across the screen almost on its own, opening message after message, the words blurring together. Late payment notice. Insufficient funds. Attempted withdrawal declined. Her breath came faster, shallow, like the air in the cabin had gone thin. Then she saw it. The last message in the thread, sent 3 days ago, right around the time Russell said he was driving into town for supplies. "This is for the best. Don't look for me." The words sat there on the screen, small and plain. No explanation, no apology, just that. 10 words to end everything. Emily stared at it so long the screen dimmed and went dark on its own. She sat, frozen, phone still gripped in her hand, her whole body gone rigid and still, the way a person goes still right before they understand something they can't take back. "Emily." Deacon's voice, gentler now. He'd set down his coffee. "What did it say?" She didn't answer. She woke the screen back up with a shaking thumb and opened the banking app instead, the blue icon she hadn't touched in days. It asked for her password. Her fingers trembled so bad it took her 3 tries to type it in. The account balance loaded slow, the little wheel spinning on the screen. Then the number appeared, $0.00. She blinked at it, sure it was wrong, sure the screen was broken or the signal was bad, and the number would fix itself if she just waited. She refreshed it. The number stayed the same. 0. Their joint account, the one that held every dollar they had, the one Russell said he'd check on the morning he left for supplies, sat empty as the cabin's cupboards. "He didn't get lost," Emily said, and her voice came out strange, flat, like it belonged to someone else. "He didn't have an accident. He planned this." Deacon went very still beside her. "He drove us out here," she said, staring at the screen like it might change if she looked hard enough. Told us it was a family trip. Told the kids we'd roast marshmallows. Her hands shook harder now, the phone rattling faintly against her palm. He took everything, every cent, and he just left us here. On purpose. She looked up at Deacon, and whatever composure she'd been holding on to cracked wide open. He planned this, she said again, like saying it twice might make it make sense. He wanted us stuck out here. He wanted it to look like an accident. Deacon's jaw tightened, a muscle working at the side of his face. His hands had curled into fists without him seeming to notice, knuckles gone white, the coffee cup forgotten on the ground beside him. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The fury building behind his eyes said enough. Deacon stood up slow, the way a man stands when something inside him has already decided what's going to happen next. His voice, when it came, was low and hard as stone. I know people, he said. Guys who can find anybody. Bank records leave a trail. Phone leaves a trail. Man like that, running scared, he's not smart enough to disappear clean. He reached for the jacket hanging off the porch rail, movements quick and sure. I'll find him, and I'll make him understand exactly what he did to you and these kids. Deacon! He kept moving, checking his pocket for his keys, his mind already 3 steps down a road that led somewhere dark. Deacon, stop. Emily's hand closed around his forearm, gripping hard, her fingers digging into the leather of his jacket. He looked down at her hand, then at her face, and what he saw there stopped him better than any word could have. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set the same stubborn way his was. She wasn't asking. She was telling him. Please don't go after him. Emily, he left you out here to die. You and the kids. He drained every dollar you had and drove away smiling, probably. Somebody's got to answer for that. I know what he did. Her voice cracked on the word did, but she didn't let go of his arm. I know exactly what he did, better than anybody. I lived it. I watched him smile at Sophie and Tucker the whole drive out here, telling them about marshmallows, and I know now every word out of his mouth was a lie. She swallowed hard. But I don't want you to go find him. Why not? The question came out rough, almost angry, though not at her. Because it won't fix anything. She said it plain, the way a person says something they've already turned over in their mind 100 times. You go find him, and maybe you scare him, maybe worse than scare him. And then what? You end up in trouble, real trouble. Cops, maybe worse, and my kids. Her voice broke fully now, the tears spilling over. My kids have already lost one man who was supposed to protect them, and instead just walked away. I am not going to let them watch another man they've started to trust go do something violent because of me. I can't. I won't survive that. Not again. Deacon's jaw worked, the muscle jumping under the skin, his whole body coiled tight like a spring. Behind him, Tank had come around the side of the cabin, drawn by the sound of raised voices, and he stood there quiet, watching, his big arms crossed over his chest. Whistler stood a few feet off, saying nothing either, but his eyes moved from Emily to Deacon and back, waiting. I just want my kids safe, Emily said again, softer now, like she'd said it so many times in her head it had worn smooth. That's all I want. Not revenge, not justice even, not the kind you're thinking of. I want them fed, I want them warm. I want them to stop being scared every time a car door slams. That's it, that's the whole thing. Deacon looked at her a long moment. He looked at the 2 kids still sleeping on the cabin floor behind her, Tucker's arm flung over his sister, both of them innocent to the storm passing over their mother's face. Something in his chest, tight and burning since he'd read that message over her shoulder, began to loosen. Not disappear, just loosen enough to breathe around. He let out a slow breath through his nose and unclenched his fist. "Okay," he said. Emily blinked like she hadn't expected him to actually stop. "Okay," he said again, quieter. "I won't go after him. Not like that." He looked past her to Tank, then to Whistler, some silent understanding passing between the three men, a decision made without a single word needing to be spoken. "But you and these kids aren't going back to nothing, Emily. Not after this. Me and my brothers, we're going to make sure you're taken care of. Food, firewood, whatever the van needs. Whatever you need, that's not up for discussion." Tank gave a short nod, arms still crossed, and Whistler's mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile, but meant the same thing. This wasn't going to be one visit and gone. Every man standing in that cabin doorway understood that now, the same moment Emily did. 3 days later, the trail to the cabin had already started to feel worn under Deacon's tires, like a path his bike knew on its own now. He came around the last bend with Tank riding just behind him, the two engines growling low through the trees. The cabin looked different in the morning light than it had that first night. Smoke curled steady from the chimney instead of dying out. Someone had swept the porch. Emily stood in the doorway when she heard them coming, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and Deacon felt something settle in his chest at the sight of her standing there like she belonged. "Morning," she said, and there was less guard in her voice than there'd been 3 days ago. Not gone. Just less. "Morning." Deacon swung off his bike. "Tank's gonna take a look at the van." Tank was already walking toward the minivan, popping the hood before anybody said another word. He leaned over the engine, poking around with the kind of quiet focus a surgeon might have, grease already finding its way onto his knuckles. Sophie came out onto the porch first, peeking around her mother's leg, and Tucker barreled past both of them straight for the motorcycles, his little sneakers slapping against the wood steps. "Careful," Emily called, but there wasn't much worry behind it. Tucker had learned already, in just a few visits, exactly how careful he needed to be, and Deacon had shown him which parts got hot. A second engine sound rose up the trail, quieter than a motorcycle, and a few minutes later Carol's sedan rolled into the clearing. She climbed out with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder, the kind doctors used to carry before everything went digital, and gave Emily a warm smile. "Brought my bag of tricks," Carol said. "Figured it was past time somebody looked these two over properly." Emily hesitated only a second before nodding. "Thank you. I mean that." Carol sat up at the little table inside, laying out a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, a small flashlight. Sophie went first, sitting stiff and wide-eyed, while Carol checked her ears, her throat, listened to her chest. "You're being so brave," Carol told her, and Sophie's shoulders came down an inch. Tucker squirmed through his exam, more interested in Carol's stethoscope than in sitting still, but Carol laughed it off, patient as anything, letting him listen to his own heartbeat before she finished. When she was done, Carol sat back and looked at Emily with the kind of steady, honest face that came from decades of delivering hard news gently. "They're malnourished," she said plainly. "Both of them. Nothing dangerous, nothing that won't fix itself with regular meals and some rest. But their weight's low for their age, and Sophie's a little anemic. Nothing a good diet and some time won't turn around." Emily's hand came up to her mouth, and Deacon watched her eyes fill, watched her fight to keep the tears from spilling in front of the kids. "They're going to be okay," Carol said again, softer now, reaching out to squeeze Emily's arm. "You did right by them. You kept them alive out here. Now we just build them back up." Outside, Tank straightened up from under the hood, wiping his hands on a rag, and walked over to the porch. "Alternator's shot," he said. "That's your problem. Van's not going anywhere till that's replaced." He glanced toward Deacon. "I know a yard outside of town. Got a match for this model. I can have it in by next week." Deacon nodded, already turning his eyes upward, toward the roofline where a dark water stain spread across the ceiling boards inside, a stain that told its own story every time it rained. "That roof's not going to hold through winter," he said. "Not the way it's going?" Tank followed his gaze and grunted in agreement. Whistler, who'd shown up sometime during Carol's exam and had been leaning quiet against the porch rail, spoke up now. "I can get shingles cheap. Know a guy. We do it right, we could have it patched before the first snow." Emily looked between the three of them, and something in her face cracked open. Not from fear this time, but from something warmer, harder to name. She didn't argue. She didn't tell them it was too much. She just nodded, slow, like she was letting herself believe it. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." The days settled into a rhythm none of them talked about, but all of them counted on. Every other morning, Deacon's bike came rumbling up the trail, saddlebags loaded down with groceries, sometimes a sack of firewood strapped across the back seat. He never made a show of it. He'd just carry the bags in, set them on the counter, and start unloading like it was the most normal thing in the world for a leather-clad stranger to be stocking somebody's kitchen. "You don't have to keep doing this," Emily told him one morning, arms crossed, though her voice had lost its edge. "I know," Deacon said, and kept unloading. That was usually the end of the conversation. She'd learned by now that arguing with him was like arguing with a mountain. He'd just stand there, quiet and solid, until she gave up. Tucker had taken to waiting by the window for the sound of the engine, and the second he heard it, he'd be out the door before Emily could even call after him. By the third visit, Deacon had brought along an old parts diagram, the paper soft and creased from years of folding, showing every piece of a motorcycle engine laid out like a treasure map. "This here's the piston," Deacon said, crouching down so he was eye level with the boy, tracing a thick finger along the paper. "It goes up and down, real fast, and that's what makes the power." Tucker's eyes went wide like Deacon had just handed him the secrets of the universe. "Up and down like a pogo stick?" "Kind of like that. Only a lot faster, and it don't bounce around much." "Can I touch it?" "Not while it's running, but come here." Deacon walked him over to his parked bike, popped a small side panel, and let Tucker peer inside at the still, silent engine. The boy's small hands hovered over the metal like it was something sacred, and Deacon let him look as long as he wanted, never once rushing him. Sophie watched from a distance those first few days, always a few steps back, always ready to retreat inside if Deacon so much as glanced her way too fast. She carried a small spiral notebook everywhere, its pages filled with crayon drawings, mostly horses, their manes wild and colorful, some of them galloping across pages scribbled with green grass and yellow suns. It was on the fourth visit that she finally came closer, standing near the porch steps, notebook clutched to her chest. "You draw those?" Deacon asked, not looking straight at her, just tossing the question out easy, like it didn't matter much either way. Sophie nodded, still hesitant. "Can I see?" She hesitated, then walked over slow and held the notebook out, flipping to a page with a brown horse standing under a big yellow sun. Deacon took his time looking at it, really looking, the way he'd look at an engine part he was trying to understand. "That's a real fine horse," he said. "Looks fast." "She's named Ginger," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She runs faster than anything." "I believe it." Deacon handed the notebook back careful, like it was something breakable. You draw another one next time? I'd like to see it. Sophie almost smiled. Almost. By the end of the week, something in her had loosened. She started sitting closer during Tucker's engine lessons, sometimes adding her own questions. And one afternoon she laughed. A real laugh, when Tucker got grease on his nose and didn't notice for a full 10 minutes. Emily stood in the doorway that afternoon, dish towel forgotten in her hands, watching her children laugh with this big, rough man who had tattoos crawling up his arms and a beard like a mountain man's. Tucker was pointing excitedly at something under the seat of Deacon's bike, and Sophie was giggling behind her hand. And for a moment, just a moment, the cabin didn't feel like the place where they'd almost died. It felt like something else, something warmer. Emily felt a small flicker of trust rising in her chest, unfamiliar and fragile, like a candle lit in a room that had been dark too long. But she didn't let it grow past a flicker. She'd believed a man's promises before. She'd believed Russell would take care of them, would protect them, would never leave. She'd learned the hard way what happened when you let your guard down completely. So she watched from the doorway, arms crossed loose over her chest, and let herself feel the warmth, without quite trusting it yet. The minivan smelled like new plastic and engine oil, courtesy of Tank's work under the hood, and Emily gripped the wheel like it might disappear if she let go too soon. Sophie sat up front, still not quite trusting the front seat, while Tucker bounced in the back, kicking his feet against the seat in front of him. "Are we really getting real food?" Tucker asked. "Not just the food Deacon brings?" "We're getting real food," Emily said. "Whatever you want, within reason." The envelope of cash sat in her purse, folded careful, counted twice already. She still didn't fully understand how it had gotten there. Whistler had mentioned something about chapter funds, said it like it was nothing, like passing along a few $100s to a stranger was as normal as holding a door open. Emily had tried to refuse it 3 times before finally taking it, her hands shaking, her pride cracking down the middle. Main Street in town was small, just a stretch of brick buildings with faded awnings, a hardware store, a post office, and Betty's Diner sitting on the corner with a blinking neon sign that had been missing its apostrophe for as long as anyone could remember. Emily parked out front and sat for a second, just looking at it. "Can we go in?" Sophie asked, pointing at the window where a chalkboard sign advertised milkshakes. "We can go in," Emily said, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of her own voice saying yes to something so simple. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease, the kind of smell that meant comfort. A woman with silver hair pulled back tight, wearing a name tag that said, Betty, looked up from behind the counter and gave them a polite nod. Emily slid into a booth with the kids, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself order without doing math in her head first. Milkshakes, burgers, fries for the table. Tucker was midway through describing, in exhaustive detail, the exact placement of a motorcycle's spark plug when the rumble started outside. Low at first, then closer, then unmistakable, 2 engines pulling up right out front. Betty's head turned toward the window fast, her spine going straight. Emily saw it happen, the way the woman's face shifted, jaw tightening, eyes narrowing as she watched Deacon and Tank swing off their bikes and stride toward the door, leather jackets, boots, tattoos catching the afternoon light. The bell over the door jingled, and the whole diner seemed to hold its breath for a second. Betty's hand drifted toward the phone mounted on the wall, like she was calculating how fast she could dial for help if she needed to. But Tucker was already waving both arms over his head. "Deacon! Tank! We're over here!" Deacon lifted a hand in greeting, calm as anything, and walked over like he'd done it 100 times, sliding into the booth across from Sophie, who scooted over to make room without being asked. Tank folded himself into the seat next to Emily, nearly too big for it, and grabbed a menu like he hadn't just made half the diner nervous by existing. Betty watched from the counter, arms crossed now, her suspicion plain on her face. She'd heard things about that motorcycle club, whispers mostly, nothing solid, just enough to make her wary. She didn't come to take their order. She sent a young waitress instead, and kept her own eyes fixed on the booth the whole time, like she was waiting for trouble to start. But trouble didn't start. Deacon just talked engines with Tucker, nodded along while Sophie showed him a new horse drawing, and split an order of fries with Tank like they were at a family dinner. When the meal was done and the plates cleared, Emily reached for her purse, already counting in her head what she owed. She waved the waitress down. "Check, please." The girl looked flustered for a second. "Oh, it's already been taken care of." Emily blinked. "What? By who?" The waitress glanced toward the booth, but Deacon was already standing, stretching, acting like he hadn't heard a word of it, already talking to Tucker about getting back to the cabin before dark. Behind the counter, Betty had seen it too, had seen the quiet nod Deacon gave the waitress earlier. The folded bills passed without a word, without so much as a glance for credit. Her arms loosened from across her chest, just slightly, her suspicion softening into something closer to curiosity. The cabin's front room had become a kind of command center by late afternoon. Sunlight slanting through the freshly washed windows and falling across the old wooden table where Emily had piled every scrap of paper she could find. A cardboard box sat between her and Deacon, its flaps bent soft from years of handling, Russell's stuff written on the side in faded marker that wasn't even Russell's handwriting. Emily had found it shoved under the cabin's one closet, forgotten behind a stack of moldy life vests. "School district wants birth certificates, proof of residency, immunization records," Emily said, reading off a printed list Carol had brought over the day before. "I don't even know if half this stuff is in here." "We'll find it," Deacon said. He'd pulled a chair out for himself, the wood creaking under his weight, and rolled his sleeves up like he was getting ready for real work. His hands, thick and scarred from decades of engine grease and knuckle-busting, looked strange holding delicate old papers. But he was careful with them, careful in a way that surprised Emily every time she noticed it. They worked through the box together, sorting into piles. Old insurance forms, a stack of Tucker's baby pictures, edges curled. A rubber band snapped when Emily tried to slide it off a bundle of receipts, and she laughed, a short, surprised sound, the first real laugh Deacon had heard out of her all week. "Found Sophie's birth certificate," she said, holding it up like a prize. "Tucker's got to be in here somewhere, too." Deacon kept digging, his fingers brushing past old tax forms, expired car registration, a photograph of Emily much younger, smiling in a way she didn't smile anymore. He set that one aside gently, face down, not sure if she wanted to see it right now. "Here," he said, pulling out a folded certificate with Tucker's name on it. "This one's got a coffee stain on it, but it's readable." "That's fine. That's perfect." Emily took it from him, added it to the growing pile of things that mattered. "I swear Russell just threw everything in boxes whenever we moved. Never organized a single thing in his life." "Man who runs off on his own family isn't exactly known for being organized," Deacon said, and Emily huffed a small laugh at that too, though there was an edge under it, something that still hurt when she poked at it. The box was getting lighter, the important papers mostly separated out. Deacon reached toward the bottom, feeling around past a stack of old magazines and a broken calculator, his fingers closing around something stiff, heavier stock than the rest of the papers. He pulled it out. It was a folded document, official-looking, the kind of paper that had been through a printer at some government office. The creases were worn soft, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. Deacon opened it without much thought, expecting another insurance form or maybe an old lease. His eyes moved across the top of the page. Property deed, county records office, legal description of land, coordinates, boundary lines describing acreage that matched almost exactly the plot of land they were sitting on right now. Then his eyes dropped to the name printed under owner of record. Michael J. Reyes. Deacon's hands went still. Completely still. The way his whole body used to go still in the moments before something bad happened. Some old instinct from years back kicking in even though there was no danger here. Nothing but a piece of paper. Mikey. He hadn't seen his brother's full name written out like that in 3 years. Not since the funeral programs. Not since the paperwork nobody in the family had wanted to touch afterward. The lawyers and forms that all got shoved into a drawer because going through his brother's things felt like admitting he was really gone. Deacon? Emily's voice came from somewhere far off, like she was speaking through water. You okay? You went kind of pale there. He didn't answer right away. His thumb moved across his brother's name, tracing the letters like he could feel them. Like touching the ink might tell him something the words alone couldn't. Deacon. Emily set down the papers in her hands and leaned toward him. You're scaring me a little. What is it? He set the deed down on the table like it might break, smoothed it flat with his palm, though it didn't need smoothing. He needed something to do with his hands. This land, he said slowly. This cabin. It belonged to my brother. Emily's face went blank with confusion. Your brother? Mikey. Saying the name out loud felt strange, like a muscle he hadn't used in a long time. Michael Reyes. My older brother. 3 years older than me. He tapped the paper, right where the name was printed. That's him. Michael J. Reyes, owner of record. Emily looked at the deed, then back at Deacon, like she was waiting for him to tell her it was a joke, or a mistake, some coincidence with a name that only sounded the same. But his face wasn't joking. His face had gone someplace far away. He died 3 years ago, Deacon said. Motorcycle accident, wet road, a curve he'd ridden 100 times before, a truck that didn't see him in time. He said it plain, the way you say things you've said so many times in your own head that the words have worn smooth, lost their sharp edges. He was the one who got me into riding in the first place, taught me everything. We used to ride this trail together, back before either of us had families or responsibilities or any of it, just us and the road. Emily didn't say anything. She just watched him, letting him get through it at his own pace. He bought land out here years back, Deacon went on. Told me about it once, over beers, said he wanted a place to get away from everything. I never came out to see it. Never had the time, or made the time, I guess. His jaw tightened. After he died, there was a mess of paperwork. Lawyers, estate stuff, things nobody in the family wanted to deal with. It got put in a drawer somewhere and left there. I never even knew for sure where this land was located. Never asked. Couldn't stand to. The room had gone very quiet. Outside, a bird called somewhere in the trees, sharp and clear. Then silence again. I've been riding this trail every month for 3 years, Deacon said, more to himself now than to her. Same trail, same distance, same turnaround point. Never came farther than that ridge. Never knew this cabin was sitting right here the whole time. His cabin. Emily's hand went to her mouth. Understanding dawned across her face slowly, then all at once, like a light switching on in a dark room. Oh my God, her voice cracked. Deacon, I didn't know, I swear to you, I didn't know any of this. Emily, no, listen. She was talking fast now, words tumbling over each other, her hands twisting in her lap. Russell found this place online. Some website, one of those listings for abandoned properties, places nobody was using. He said it was free for the taking, that nobody would ever come looking for us out here. That's why he picked it. He never said anything about who owned it. I don't think he even knew or cared. We just moved in. I've been living on your family's land for almost a year, and I never even asked whose it was. I just assumed it was empty because nobody wanted it." Her voice was shaking now, guilt spilling out of her. "I am so sorry. We'll leave. We'll figure something else out. I never meant to take something that wasn't ours." "Emily." Deacon said her name firm enough to cut through her spiral. And she stopped, chest still rising fast with the apology she hadn't finished saying. "Stop, this isn't a problem. You're not in trouble. But it's your family's land, your brother's land, and we've been squatting here without even knowing—" "I know." He reached over and put his hand flat on the table, not touching her, just steady, grounding. "And I'm telling you, it's not a problem. If anything." He looked around the room, at the walls his brother had put up with his own hands, at the window light falling across the table where they sat. "I think Mikey led me back here. I've been avoiding this land for 3 years because I couldn't face it, and then one ride, 1 month, the trail wasn't empty anymore. You were here. Your kids were here." He shook his head slowly, like the whole shape of it was only now coming together in his mind. "That's not an accident. That's not nothing." The clubhouse smelled like coffee and motor oil, the way it always did on meeting nights. Deacon sat at the long table with the rest of the chapter, half listening to Whistler pitch his idea, his mind still back at the cabin with Emily and the deed and everything that came with it. "A run," Whistler said again, tapping the table for emphasis. "Through town. We get the word out, get some other chapters to roll in, make it a real event. Charity run for a local family in need. We don't use her name, don't say where she lives, just say a family's had some hard luck and needs help getting back on their feet." He looked around at the others. "People love that stuff. They'll show up. We could raise real money in one day, more than we've been scraping together ourselves." Tank nodded slowly. "Cabin still needs a new roof. Kids need clothes for school. Emily's got nothing to her name since Russell cleaned her out." He crossed his big arms. "I'm in." Deacon rubbed the back of his neck. Part of him liked the idea, the practical sense of it. They needed money, more than the chapter could keep quietly pulling out of their own pockets. But another part of him, the part that had spent 3 years keeping his grief and his brother's land private, worried about pulling back a curtain that was better left closed. "I don't want her turned into some story people gossip about," Deacon said. "I don't want cameras pointed at her kids, or people showing up at the cabin asking questions." "Nobody's naming her," Whistler said. "Nobody even needs to know where she lives. We just say a mother and her 2 kids got left with nothing, and the club wants to help. That's true. That's all people need." Deacon looked around the table, at the faces of men who'd already given so much without being asked twice. Somebody in the back muttered that it was a damn good idea, and a few others agreed. Deacon finally nodded, slow, still not fully at ease with it, but knowing they were right. "Fine," he said, "but we do it careful." Word went out over the next 2 weeks. Flyers went up in the diner, in the hardware store, in the gas station out on Route 9. Other chapters got called in, riders showing up from 3 counties over, all of it building toward one Saturday in early autumn, when the whole town seemed to know something big was happening. The morning of the run, Deacon stood outside the clubhouse and watched motorcycles fill the lot. Chrome catching the early sun, engines rumbling low and steady like a heartbeat multiplied 100 times over. Bikes lined up 2 by 2, riders pulling on gloves, checking mirrors, some of them men Deacon hadn't seen in years, men who'd come just because Whistler made a call and said it was for a family that needed help. By noon, they rode into town square in a long, thundering line, chrome and leather and noise filling the streets. People came out of shops to watch, kids pointing and waving, the diner owner standing in her doorway with a dish towel still in her hand, smiling despite herself. Tables were set up along the square with jars for donations, a hand-painted sign reading, "Help a local family get back on their feet," propped against a folding table. Emily stood off to the side near the edge of the square, Sophie's hand in one of hers, Tucker practically vibrating with excitement at all the noise and shine of the bikes. She hadn't wanted to come, not really, worried it would feel like charity on display. But Deacon had asked her gently if she'd let the kids see it, and she hadn't been able to say no to that. Tank lifted Tucker up onto the seat of his own bike, showing him how to hold the handlebars, laughing when the boy made engine noises with his mouth. Sophie, shyer, still climbed up onto Whistler's bike when he offered, sitting proud and small against the leather seat, grinning for the first time in what felt like weeks. By evening, as the sun dipped low and gold over the rooftops, Whistler counted the donation jars at the folding table, running the numbers twice to be sure. "Just over $6,000, he said, shaking his head like he could hardly believe it himself. Emily stood at the edge of the square, watching her children perched proudly on parked motorcycles, surrounded by leather-clad strangers who had become, somehow, without her ever asking for it, family. Tears slipped down her cheeks, quiet and steady, and she didn't bother wiping them away. The Monday after the run, 3 trucks rolled up Miller's Creek Trail loaded with lumber, shingles, and pipe fittings. Tank drove the first one, his arm hanging out the window, whistling some old country tune like he didn't have a care in the world. Behind him came 2 more chapter members Deacon trusted with tools, men named Cricket and Ortiz, who'd spent their lives fixing things other people had given up on. They worked from sunup to sundown for 4 straight days. Tank tore the old roof off first, peeling back rotted shingles that had let rain drip straight into the kitchen for who knew how many winters. Underneath, the wood was soft and gray, soaked through. He shook his head at it, muttering something about how the whole place was lucky it hadn't caved in already. By the second day, fresh plywood covered the roof, and by the third, new shingles lay in even rows, dark green and solid against the autumn sky. Cricket handled the plumbing, crawling under the cabin with a flashlight clenched in his teeth, cursing at old pipes until he'd replaced enough of them that water ran clear and steady from the kitchen tap for the first time in years. Ortiz built a stone base by the back wall and set a proper wood-burning stove into it, one Whistler had found second-hand but in good shape, testing the draft twice before he'd let anyone light a fire in it. Sophie and Tucker watched most of it from the porch steps, close enough to see but far enough to stay out of the way. Tucker asked Tank so many questions about hammers and nails that Tank finally handed him a small one and let him bang in a few practice nails on a scrap board, grinning the whole time, like it was the best gift he could have given the boy. Sophie sat quiet with her sketchbook, drawing the men working, the truck, the stove going into the wall, filling page after page with her careful crayon lines. Emily started her shifts at the diner that same week. The owner, a stout woman named Peg, who'd warmed up slow but sure after watching Deacon quietly settle Emily's tab more than once, offered her 3 afternoons a week to start. "See how it goes," Peg said, tying an apron around Emily's waist herself. "You're a hard worker, I can tell already." Emily came home each evening smelling like coffee and fry oil, tired in a way that felt different from the tired she'd carried those first weeks at the cabin. This tired felt earned. It felt like something moving forward instead of something being taken from her. By Friday evening, the cabin looked like a different place entirely. The new roof caught the last orange light of the day, and smoke curled up thin and steady from the stovepipe for the first time. Emily stood in the kitchen after the kids were finally down, running her hand along the countertop, still not quite believing any of it was real. She found Deacon out on the porch, sitting on the top step, looking out at the trees going dark blue in the dusk. She sat down beside him, careful, still not fully used to how easy it felt to be near him now. "Warmer in there tonight?" she said. "First time in a year the kids didn't need 3 blankets." Deacon nodded, quiet for a moment. "Mikey built the first stove that used to sit there," he said finally, before it broke down. "He always said a cabin wasn't a home till you could hear the wood cracking in the fire at night." Emily looked over at him. It was rare, him bringing up his brother without her asking first. "You don't talk about him much." "Don't need to most days, but there's something about this place." He shook his head slow. "Feels different now. Not just his anymore." Emily wrapped her arms around her knees, staring out at the dark trees. "Russell used to say I was lucky he even married me. Told me I wouldn't survive a week without him handling things." She let out a small, tired laugh. "Guess he was wrong about that." "Guess he was," Deacon said quietly. They sat there a while longer, the stove ticking warm behind them, the woods settling into night, neither one in any hurry to say more. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm nobody had planned, but everybody welcomed. Deacon came by 3, sometimes 4 times a week. He never called ahead. He'd just show up on his bike around the time school let out, and Tucker would hear the engine from half a mile off and go tearing out to the porch to watch him roll in. "You're gonna wear a hole in the porch boards," Emily told her son one afternoon, laughing as Tucker bounced on his toes waiting for Deacon to cut the engine. "He's gonna show me the carburetor today," Tucker announced, like it was the biggest secret in the world. "Is he now?" "He said I did good with the spark plugs last time." Deacon had started small, showing Tucker how an engine breathed, how fuel and air met fire and turned into motion. He kept a set of tools in his saddlebag just for this, worn wrenches sized for small hands, and he'd crouch beside the boy for an hour at a stretch, patient as still water, letting Tucker turn bolts himself even when it took him 3 times as long as it would have taken Deacon alone. "You don't gotta let him do it slow like that," Tank said once, watching from the yard. Deacon didn't even look up. "That's the only way it sticks." Sophie took longer to come around, same as she did with everything. But she'd taken to sitting on the porch steps with her sketchbook while Deacon and Tucker worked. And one afternoon in early October, she held up a drawing without being asked. It was Deacon's motorcycle, drawn careful and exact. Chrome pipes shaded in silver crayon, the seat a deep brown. "That's a fine bike," Deacon said, studying it like it was hanging in a museum. Sophie beamed. "I got the mirrors right this time." "You sure did." A week after that, she called him Uncle Deacon for the first time, so easy and natural that nobody made a fuss over it, though Emily had to turn toward the sink and blink hard for a second before anybody saw her face. Emily herself was changing too, in ways so small at first that she almost didn't notice them herself. She stopped flinching when Tank dropped a wrench too loud in the yard. She stopped going quiet and small when Whistler raised his voice cheering at something on the radio. She laughed more, real laughs that came up from her chest instead of the careful, polite ones she used to give Russell to keep the peace. At the diner, Peg noticed it too, telling her one slow afternoon that she seemed like she was standing up straighter these days, hun. "Guess I am," Emily said, and meant it. By the middle of October, Whistler decided it was time. "Chapter's having a little get-together this weekend," he told Deacon one evening at the cabin, Carol beside him with a casserole dish balanced on her hip. "Nothing big, burgers, some music. Figured it's about time Emily and the kids came out and saw the clubhouse." Emily looked uncertain at first, standing in her kitchen with a dish towel in her hands. "I don't want to intrude on anything." "Intrude," Carol laughed, setting the casserole down. Honey, half the chapter's been asking when they get to meet Tucker properly. He's basically famous at this point, the way Tank talks about him. So that Saturday, Emily loaded the kids into the minivan, running smooth now thanks to Tank's work under the hood, and drove the 20 minutes into town to the clubhouse, a low brick building with motorcycles lined up out front like a row of gleaming animals resting in the sun. Inside, it was warmer than she expected. String lights hung along the rafters, the smell of grilled meat drifting from a smoker out back. Tucker took off running the second he saw Tank, and Sophie clung close to Emily's side for exactly 4 minutes before Carol coaxed her over to a table covered in board games. Deacon found Emily near the drink cooler, handing her a soda without being asked. "They're happy," he said, nodding toward the kids. "They are." Emily looked around at the room, at the leather and tattoos and loud laughter that had once seemed so frightening to her, and felt none of that fear now. "I don't know how to thank you all for this, any of it." Carol overheard, walking past with a plate of burgers. "Thank us, please. This family's been unofficially adopted by the whole chapter months ago. We're just making it official tonight." She winked. "Somebody get this woman a chapter jacket." The room erupted in laughter, someone hollering agreement from across the hall, Tank raising his soda can in a mock toast, Whistler grinning wide beside him. Emily laughed too, feeling something settle warm and solid in her chest, looking around at all these rough, kind faces that had somehow become the closest thing to family she and her children had ever known. The afternoon had been quiet, the kind of quiet Emily was still learning to trust. Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her crayons spread out like a rainbow that had spilled across the wood. Tucker was in the yard, running a stick along the fence like it was a drumstick, making engine noises under his breath the way he always did now. Deacon had left an hour ago, riding into town for a part Tank needed for the minivan, promising he'd be back before supper. Emily had watched him go with a feeling she still wasn't used to, something warm and steady, like the house itself breathed easier when he was near. She was drying a dish at the sink when she heard the truck. It wasn't Deacon's engine. She knew that sound now, deep and familiar as a heartbeat. This was different, a rattling cough of an engine that made her stomach drop before her mind even caught up to why. She looked out the window above the sink and felt the air leave her lungs. Russell! His truck was pulling up the gravel drive too fast, kicking up dust, and even from here she could see his face through the windshield, red and tight, his jaw working like he was already mid-argument with someone who wasn't there yet. "Sophie, baby, go to your room," Emily said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. Sophie looked up, crayon frozen in her hand. "Mama? Now, sweetheart? Please." Sophie didn't argue. She'd learned, same as Emily had, when a voice meant business. She scooped her crayons into her arms and disappeared down the hall. Emily stepped outside just as Russell slammed his truck door hard enough that it bounced back open behind him. He didn't even seem to notice. He was already storming toward the porch, and Tucker, sweet Tucker who didn't know any better, called out, "Dad?" from the yard, his stick still in his hand. "Get your things, buddy," Russell said, not even looking at him, eyes locked on Emily. "We're going." "Tucker, go inside," Emily said, and something in her tone must have carried enough weight, because the boy's face crumpled with confusion, but he ran for the porch and slipped past his mother through the door. Russell reached the steps. Up close, he looked worse than Emily remembered. Thinner, unshaven. His shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in the truck. Whatever life he'd run off chasing, it hadn't been kind to him. "I want to see my kids," he said. "You don't get to just show up here." Emily planted herself in front of the door, arms crossed, though her hands were shaking so hard she had to grip her own elbows to hide it. "They're my kids, too." You left us in the woods, Russell. 3 days. No food, no firewood. You think you get to just walk back in?" His face twisted. "I'm still their father." "You stopped being their father the day you drove off." That was when his voice cracked open into something uglier. "You think you can keep them from me? I've got rights. I'll take this to court. I'll drag you through every judge in this county, and I will get them back where they belong, with their real family, not out here in the middle of nowhere with a bunch of bikers playing house." "Get off my porch," Emily said, and her voice didn't shake even though everything else in her did. "This isn't over," Russell snapped, jabbing a finger toward her. "You hear me? This isn't over. I'll be back with a lawyer, and we'll see how good you look to a judge, living off charity from a motorcycle gang." He turned, stomped back down the steps, and Emily didn't move, didn't breathe, until she heard his truck door slam and the engine cough back to life. Gravel sprayed as he reversed too fast, nearly clipping the mailbox. And then he was gone, the sound of his engine fading down the long drive until the quiet swallowed it whole. Emily's knees gave out. She sat down hard on the porch step, hands pressed over her mouth, her whole body trembling like a struck bell. That was when she heard the low, familiar rumble of a different engine coming up the drive, and looked up to see Deacon's motorcycle rounding the bend, a few minutes too late. Deacon cut the engine before he even reached the top of the drive, letting the bike roll the last few feet in silence. He was off it before it fully stopped, boots hitting gravel hard, eyes already scanning the porch, the yard, the road behind him for any sign of what had happened. Emily was folded over on the steps, arms wrapped tight around herself, shoulders shaking with the kind of crying that didn't make sound anymore, just breath and tremor. Sophie stood in the doorway behind her, one hand fisted in the back of her mother's shirt, eyes wide and wet. Tucker was pressed against Emily's side, his stick forgotten somewhere in the yard, his small face buried against her arm. Deacon didn't ask questions. He crossed the yard in a few long strides and lowered himself onto the step beside Emily, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, solid and still. "I'm here," he said quietly. "I'm right here." Emily turned toward him like his voice was the only steady thing left in the world, and for a moment she just shook, unable to get words out. Deacon didn't push. He put a hand on her back, slow, careful circles, the same way he'd once seen his mother calm his brother during a nightmare, decades ago, in a house that didn't exist anymore. "Russell," Emily finally managed. "He came. He was yelling. He said he's getting a lawyer, said he's taking them, said—" Her voice cracked and broke apart again. Sophie sniffled from the doorway. "He scared me, Mama." "I know, baby," Emily said, reaching a hand back for her daughter without looking, an old, worn instinct. "I know." Deacon looked at the children, at their pale, frightened faces, and something in his chest tightened like a fist closing around Cole. But his voice, when he spoke, stayed level. "Nobody's taking anybody anywhere. You hear me? Not while I'm breathing." He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and made the call to Carol without waiting for Emily to ask. "Carol, it's Deacon. Russell showed up at the cabin, scared the kids pretty bad. Can you come sit with Sophie and Tucker a while? Let Emily catch her breath?" Carol arrived within 20 minutes, her sedan crunching up the drive, arms already open before she was fully out of the car. She scooped Tucker up like he weighed nothing, murmuring soft nonsense the way grandmothers do, and took Sophie's hand, leading them both inside toward the kitchen, promising something about hot cocoa and a coloring contest. The children went easily, worn out from crying, comforted by her steady, familiar warmth. Emily watched them go, her chest finally beginning to slow, and Deacon stayed beside her the whole time, saying nothing, just being there, a wall of quiet strength between her and the world. It wasn't until much later that night, after the dishes were done and the children had finally drifted off to sleep, their small chests rising and falling evenly under quilts Carol had tucked around them, that Emily came and sat across from Deacon at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold. "I keep thinking," she said softly, staring at the table like the wood held answers, "that maybe I'm not supposed to have this. All of it. The cabin, you, the kids laughing again like they used to." She swallowed hard. "Maybe trouble just finds me, no matter what. Maybe I don't get to keep the good stuff." Deacon watched her for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes steady. "That's not truth talking," he said finally. "That's Russell talking. That's every rotten thing he ever said to you still living in your head, trying to convince you that you deserve less than you do." Emily's eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. "You didn't do anything to deserve what he did," Deacon went on, his voice low but firm as iron. "Not the leaving, not today, none of it. And I promise you, this isn't how your story ends. Not like this. Not with him standing in your yard, yelling threats he's got no right to make." He reached across the table, resting his hand near hers, not quite touching, giving her room to close the distance if she wanted. "You've got people now," he said. "You've got me, and I don't walk away from what's mine to protect." The morning came in gray and quiet, the kind of light that made the whole world look tired. Deacon hadn't slept much. He'd sat up most of the night on the porch, watching the tree line, making sure Russell didn't come back for a second round. Nobody had. But Deacon's jaw still ached from clenching it so hard. He waited until 7, when he figured most decent men were awake, and pulled out his phone. Harold Whitfield picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice rough with sleep but steady underneath. "Deacon Reyes? Now there's a name I haven't heard in a while." "Harold, sorry to call so early." "You wouldn't be calling at all if it wasn't something." Harold's tone sharpened, the sleep clearing out of it fast. "What do you need?" Deacon looked out at the yard, at the spot near the porch steps where Emily had been crying just hours before. "I need a favor, a big one. After what your chapter did for my grandson, I don't think there's a favor too big. Tell me." So Deacon told him. He told him about Emily, about the cabin, about Russell driving them out here and disappearing for 3 days, about the bank accounts drained down to nothing, about the woman Russell had run off with, and about the ugly scene in the yard the night before, the yelling, the threats about lawyers and custody. He kept his voice even, but there wasn't much hiding the anger underneath it. Harold was quiet for a moment when Deacon finished. "That man sounds like he's got no leg to stand on. Financial abandonment, no contact for months. Then he shows up making threats he can't back up. That's not just weak. That's a case that writes itself if the paperwork's there to prove it." She's got the bank statements, the alerts on her phone. And I don't doubt for a second she remembers every word he said last night. "Good. Get all of it together. I'll come out and meet her myself. Take a look. See where we stand." Harold paused. "I'm retired, Deacon. Not dead. I can still put a case together when it matters." "It matters," Deacon said. "This is a good woman. Good kids. They didn't do anything to deserve what he did to them. Then we'll make sure he doesn't get to do it again." Harold's voice was firm now, the sound of a man who'd spent decades in courtrooms fighting for people who needed fighting for. "Give me the address. I'll be out this afternoon." Deacon gave him directions to the cabin, thanked him, and hung up. He sat there a moment longer on the porch step, feeling something loosen in his chest for the first time since the night before. It wasn't over, but it was moving in the right direction, and that was more than he'd had an hour ago. By the time Harold's car came rumbling up the gravel drive that afternoon, an old blue sedan that had clearly seen better decades. Emily was standing on the porch with her arms crossed, looking equal parts hopeful and terrified. Sophie and Tucker were inside with Carol, who had come back to keep them occupied with a puzzle, sparing them from having to sit through more talk of Russell. Harold climbed out of the car, slow. A tall man in his 70s with white hair combed neat and reading glasses perched on his nose. He carried a worn leather satchel under one arm, and when he shook Emily's hand, his grip was gentle but sure. "Mrs. Carter?" he said. "Deacon tells me you've had a rough go of it." "That's one way to put it," Emily said, trying for a smile that didn't quite hold. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Deacon and Emily had talked the night before, and Emily spread out everything she had. The bank statements showing the account draining to zero over a matter of days, the screenshots of frantic overdraft alerts on her phone, a notebook where she'd written down, word for word as best she remembered, everything Russell had shouted in the yard the night before, the threats about lawyers and taking the kids. Harold read through it all slowly, his glasses sliding down his nose, making small notes in the margins of a legal pad. Deacon stood near the counter, arms crossed, watching Emily's face as she waited, watching her hands twist together under the table. Finally, Harold set the papers down and looked up at her over his glasses. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I've seen a lot of cases in my time. This one isn't close. Financial abandonment, no support, and now documented threats after months of silence. We have more than enough here to terminate his parental rights permanently, and I intend to do exactly that." Emily's breath caught. "Permanently?" she repeated, like she needed to hear the word twice to believe it. "Permanently," Harold said again gently. "He won't have a claim to stand on." 3 days after Harold left with his satchel full of papers, Deacon showed up at the cabin on a Tuesday morning, later than his usual visits. He didn't come in his cut, the leather vest with the club patches. He wore a plain gray jacket instead, and something about that small change told Emily this wasn't an ordinary day. "I want to show you something," he said. "If you're willing to come?" Carol had already arrived to watch the kids, setting up a board game at the kitchen table like she'd planned it all along. Emily looked at Deacon's face, at the careful way he was holding himself, and she nodded without asking questions. They rode in his truck this time, not the bike. The drive was quiet, the radio off, the only sound the hum of tires on the road. Deacon's hands stayed tight on the wheel the whole way, knuckles pale, and Emily didn't push him to talk. She'd learned that much about him already. Some things had to come out on their own time. The cemetery sat on a small hill outside town, shaded by old oak trees that dropped their leaves across the headstones in the fall. Deacon parked the truck and sat there a moment before he opened the door, like he was gathering something up inside himself. "My brother's buried here," he finally said. "Mikey. 3 years now." They walked together through the rows of stones until they reached a simple granite marker near the back, half covered in fallen leaves. Deacon knelt and brushed them away, his hand moving slow and careful over the letters like he was afraid of hurting something. Michael Reyes, beloved brother, beloved son. "He was riding with me that day," Deacon said, standing back up. "Miller's Creek Trail. We used to ride it every month, just the two of us. He hit a patch of loose gravel on a turn we'd both taken 100 times before. I was ahead of him. I didn't even hear it happen, just looked back, and he wasn't there anymore." Emily stayed quiet, letting him find the words at his own pace. "I keep riding that trail once a month," Deacon went on. "Same day, same route. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I kept doing it, I could keep him close somehow. But I never went past where it happened. Never went to the cabin, even though I knew it was ours. Mikey's land, left to both of us when our folks passed. I couldn't make myself walk into a place that was supposed to be his. So it sat empty, Emily said softly. For 3 years? Until your husband found it online and dumped you there. Deacon shook his head, a small, tired laugh escaping him that had no humor in it. 3 years I couldn't face going near that cabin. And the one time I finally rode past it, there you were. Your kids were there, cold and scared and needing something I actually knew how to give. Emily stepped closer to him at the graveside, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You've been carrying that this whole time. The guilt. Guilt that I lived. Guilt that I let the land sit there rotting instead of doing something with it. Guilt that some strangers had to make me finally deal with what I should have handled 3 years ago. He looked down at the headstone. I don't know how to let that go, Emily. I've tried. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the stone, at the name carved into it, at the small clay pot of dried flowers someone, probably Deacon, had left there a while back. Maybe you don't have to let it go all at once, she said finally. Maybe it doesn't work that way. She turned to face him. Deacon, what if Mikey didn't want you to stay away? What if he sent you down that trail because he knew we needed you? And because he knew you needed us, too? Deacon looked at her, something breaking open in his chest that he hadn't let anyone see in 3 years. He always did care more about other people than himself, Deacon said, his voice rough. Even after. Maybe that hasn't changed, Emily said gently. Maybe he found a way to keep taking care of people. Through you. Deacon looked back down at the headstone, at his brother's name, and for the first time since the accident, the weight in his chest didn't feel quite so heavy. It didn't disappear. But it shifted, made room for something else to sit beside it. Grief and hope, side by side, the way maybe they were always meant to be. The lawyer's office sat above the hardware store on Main Street, a narrow staircase leading up to a door with peeling gold letters that read, Withers and Associates. Deacon had put this off for 3 years. Now he climbed those stairs 2 at a time, like he was afraid he'd lose his nerve if he slowed down. Frank Withers was an older man, gray at the temples, with the kind of steady handshake that made you trust him right away. He'd handled the Reyes family's affairs since Deacon's father was alive. He'd been waiting a long time for Deacon to walk through that door. Didn't think I'd see you before another year passed, Frank said, waving him into a chair across from a desk covered in neat stacks of paper. Yeah, well? Deacon sat down, his jacket creaking against the old leather. Some things finally caught up to me. Frank pulled a thick folder from a drawer, the one marked Reyes Estate, in fading black marker. Your brother's portion of the land has been sitting in probate limbo since you never finished the transfer paperwork. I've sent you letters. I know, I wasn't ready. And now? Deacon didn't hesitate. Now I need you to draw up a deed. Full transfer of the cabin and the surrounding acreage. All 12 acres, the water rights, all of it. Frank glanced up from his notepad. Transfer to who? You're already half owner. This would just clean up your claim to Mikey's half. Not to me, Deacon said. To Emily Carter. Full ownership, her name only. I want it done clean, no strings, no conditions. She owns it outright. Frank set his pen down slow, studying Deacon's face like he was checking for a joke. There wasn't one. You're aware that's a significant piece of property. Prime land, decent water access. You're just giving it away? I'm not giving it away. I'm putting it where it belongs. Deacon leaned forward, elbows on his knees. That cabin's been empty for 3 years because I couldn't stand to look at it. Emily and her kids needed a home the second they showed up on that trail, and it was sitting there waiting the whole time. Feels like it was always supposed to end up in her hands. Not mine. Frank was quiet a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding settling into the lines of his face. He'd known the Reyes family long enough to know grief when he heard it, and he'd known Deacon long enough to trust the man's judgment when his voice sounded like that. Steady. Certain. I'll need a few days to prepare the paperwork properly, Frank said. File it with the county. Make sure the title's clear of any liens from your parents' estate. I can have it ready by Friday. Friday's good. You don't want to think this over? Talk to somebody first? Deacon almost laughed. Already talked to the only person whose opinion matters. Mikey would have wanted this. I know that much for certain. Frank didn't ask any more questions after that. He simply got to work, pulling out fresh paper, jotting down details, running through the legal language that would turn 3 years of frozen grief into something solid and real. Deacon sat there and watched him work, feeling lighter with every stroke of the pen, like some old weight was finally being set down after being carried too long. Friday came fast. Deacon picked up the finished deed from Frank's office, the papers crisp and official inside a plain manila envelope, his brother's name and Emily's name both printed there in black ink, the transfer complete and legal and permanent. He held the envelope the whole ride out to the cabin, resting it careful on the truck seat beside him, like it was something fragile. The afternoon sun hung low over Miller's Creek Trail when he pulled up outside the cabin. Smoke curled up from the chimney, and he could hear Tucker's laughter drifting from the yard where Tank had set up the swing set weeks before. Sophie was on the porch steps, drawing something in a notebook, and she waved at him with her crayon before going back to her picture. Emily came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her hair pulled back loose from a day of cooking and cleaning. She smiled when she saw him, that easy smile that had taken months to earn, and now came so natural it barely seemed to cost her anything. "You're not in your cut again," she said, echoing the same words from days before, though there was no worry in her voice this time. Just curiosity. Deacon climbed the porch steps slow, the envelope held out in front of him like an offering. "Got something for you." The county courthouse was a squat brick building 3 towns over, the kind of place with worn marble floors and old ceiling fans that clicked when they turned. Emily sat on a hard wooden bench outside courtroom 4, her hands folded tight in her lap, twisting the hem of her good blouse, the only nice one she owned that still fit right. Harold Whitfield sat beside her, a leather briefcase across his knees, thick with papers. Bank statements, screenshots of Russell's messages to the woman he'd left them for, the forged receipts he'd used to explain away withdrawals, weeks of careful work, all of it building toward this morning. Deacon stood by the window down the hall, arms crossed, watching the parking lot. He'd told Emily he wasn't going to hover, but he also wasn't going to be far. "He's not here," Harold said, checking his watch again. "Court's set to start in 10 minutes. Emily's leg bounced under the bench. "He'll show. He always shows up when it's about making me look bad." But the minutes ticked by, and the hallway stayed empty except for a court clerk hurrying past with an armful of folders. At 9 o'clock sharp, the bailiff called them in, and there was still no sign of Russell. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than Emily expected, plain and quiet, sunlight coming through tall windows onto a judge's bench made of dark wood. Judge Marlene Yates was a stern-looking woman in her 60s, reading glasses perched low on her nose as she flipped through the file in front of her. "Case number 4471, she said. "Carter versus Carter. Petitioner Emily Carter present with counsel. Respondent Russell Carter." She looked up over her glasses. "Is the respondent present?" The bailiff shook his head. No, Your Honor. We attempted service at his last known address in the county and his workplace. Both came back with the individual having vacated. Second attempt located a forwarding address in another state. Certified mail was returned, unclaimed. Judge Yates's mouth pressed into a thin line. So he's aware of these proceedings and chose not to appear. He's aware, Your Honor, Harold said, standing. My office confirmed contact was made through a phone number linked to the respondent 2 weeks ago. He was informed of the hearing date directly. He indicated he had no intention of contesting. That got a small, humorless laugh out of the judge. Convenient, given the nature of the charges being prepared against him. She turned pages, scanning the reports Harold had built, the bank records, the abandonment timeline, the statement from Carol Dunn about the children's condition when they were found. Mr. Whitfield, walk me through what you have. Harold did, calm and thorough, his voice steady the way it had been through every meeting with Emily these past weeks. He laid it out plainly. The staged camping trip, the drained joint account, 3 days alone in the woods with 2 children and no way to call for help. The aggressive return weeks later, demanding rights he'd forfeited the moment he drove away. Emily sat with her hands clenched in her lap, staring straight ahead, listening to her whole nightmare read out loud in a courtroom like it was just another case file. But this time it didn't feel like shame. It felt like something being set down, finally, in front of someone with the power to make it matter. Judge Yates took her time. She read through several more pages, then set them down and folded her hands. Mr. Carter's absence today, combined with the evidence presented, speaks for itself, she said. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of financial abandonment and endangerment of the minor children, given the respondent's failure to appear, his documented flight from the jurisdiction, and the serious nature of these findings. This court grants full and sole legal and physical custody of Sophie Carter and Tucker Carter to the petitioner, Emily Carter. She paused, looking directly at Emily now. Furthermore, given the pattern of behavior demonstrated, this court orders no visitation rights be granted to the respondent, pending any future petition demonstrating substantial and verified change in circumstance. This order is effective immediately. The gavel came down light, almost gentle, but the sound of it rang through Emily like something breaking loose in her chest. Harold squeezed her shoulder. She sat there a second longer, blinking hard, before she trusted herself to stand. Outside, the courthouse doors swung open onto a bright morning, sunlight spilling gold across the marble steps. Deacon was waiting there, and when Emily stepped out beside Harold, she caught his eye and felt something in her finally go still and quiet. "It's done," she said, like she still couldn't believe the words leaving her mouth. "It's really done." The cabin looked nothing like the place Deacon had found 3 months ago. Gone was the sagging roof and the rotted porch step. In its place stood a wide wraparound porch, freshly built, the wood still smelling faintly of sawdust and paint. The walls had been scraped clean of old grime and covered in a warm yellow that caught the afternoon sun. A swing set stood near the tree line, its chains gleaming, built solid enough to last 20 years. Tank had made sure of that. By noon, the driveway was lined with motorcycles, dozens of them, chrome catching the light, engines ticking as they cooled. Bikers in leather vests mingled with their wives and kids, plates of food balanced in their hands. Someone had set up 2 long folding tables covered in casserole dishes and coolers full of soda and lemonade. Smoke curled up from a grill where Whistler stood, flipping burgers and calling out insults to anyone who got too close to his tongs. Carol had brought a sheet cake with blue icing that read, "Congratulations, Emily," in slightly crooked letters, because she'd let Tucker help write it. Harold stood near the porch steps in his usual pressed shirt, looking a little out of place among all the leather but smiling anyway, a paper plate of potato salad in his hand. Even Denise, who ran the diner in town, had driven out special, carrying a box of pies she refused to let anyone pay for. "This one's on the house," she told Emily, pressing the box into her arms. "You earned it." Emily stood on the new porch, looking out over all of it. Her chest felt full in a way she didn't have words for. 3 months ago, she'd been huddled by a dying fire, certain nobody in the world was coming to help her. Now half a motorcycle club and their families had gathered in her yard, celebrating like she'd won a war. She had. She just hadn't fought it alone. "You did good," Deacon said, coming up beside her, a paper cup of lemonade in his hand. "We did good," she corrected. He didn't argue. He never did anymore. Not about things like that. Sophie came tearing across the yard first, sneakers slapping the dirt, her hair loose from its ponytail. "Mom! Tank says I can ride my bike on the driveway if Deacon watches." "Since when do you need permission from Deacon?" Emily called back, laughing. "Since Tank said so," Sophie shouted, already running for the shed where her bike leaned against the wall. A hand-me-down Tank had fixed up with a new chain and fresh air in the tires. Tucker wasn't far behind, dragging his own bike by the handlebars, the training wheels rattling with every step. "Me too! Me too!" Deacon set his cup down on the porch rail. "Guess that's my cue." He walked down into the yard, and within minutes he'd gathered a few of the other riders around him, Tank included, all of them positioning their bikes along the long gravel driveway like an honor guard. Someone fired up their engine low and slow, more rumble than roar, easing forward at a crawl. Sophie pushed off first, wobbling but grinning, pedaling hard down the length of the driveway with the line of motorcycles rolling beside her at a careful, matching pace. The bikers whooped and hollered, waving her on like she was crossing a finish line at the biggest race in the world. "That's it, kid! Go, go, go!" Tank bellowed, pumping his fist. Tucker followed right behind her, training wheels clattering, face scrunched up with the effort of pedaling as fast as his legs could go. The bikers slowed even more for him, engines barely above idle, everyone cheering just as loud. "Look at him go!" Whistler shouted from the grill, waving his spatula in the air. Emily stood at the edge of the porch, one hand pressed against her chest, watching her children ride up and down that gravel driveway surrounded by a rumbling wall of leather and chrome, every single one of those hardened, tattooed men grinning like proud uncles, watching their own kids take their first solo ride. The evening light stretched long and gold across the yard, catching the dust kicked up by tires and engines alike. Sophie's laughter rang out clear over the noise. Tucker shrieked with joy every time a biker called his name. Emily felt tears prick at her eyes, but for the first time in longer than she could remember. They weren't tears of fear. She was home. 3 months slipped by the way good months do, quiet and quick. Emily's shift at the diner started at 6 in the morning now, and she didn't mind the early hour one bit. Denise had her running the register most days, and on the busy mornings she let Emily take over the grill too. The tips were steady. The paycheck was real, deposited into an account that had only her name on it. Every time she checked the balance, something in her chest settled a little more. Sophie had made 2 best friends in her class, girls named Priya and Ash, who came over on Saturdays to draw horses in the yard and ride bikes down the gravel driveway. Tucker had started kindergarten in the fall, and he talked about motorcycle engines so much that his teacher sent home a note asking if there was an automotive influence at home. Emily had laughed so hard reading it that she'd cried a little too. Deacon still came every week, sometimes twice. He'd shown up on Tuesdays like clockwork at first, always with some excuse. A part he needed to drop off. A tool Tank had borrowed and wanted returned. But the excuses had gotten thinner over time, until one day he just stopped making them. He'd pull his bike up the driveway, and Sophie would come running, and Tucker would already be waiting by the shed with a wrench in his hand, like he'd been expecting him. Emily noticed things had changed between her and Deacon, too, though neither one of them had said so out loud. He stayed longer now. He lingered after dinner instead of riding off right after. Sometimes she'd catch him watching her from across the kitchen while she washed dishes, and when she looked up, he wouldn't look away fast like he used to. He'd just smile, small and steady, like he had nowhere else in the world he'd rather be. She didn't know what to call it. She wasn't sure she needed to yet. That evening, after a dinner of grilled chicken and corn on the cob, Emily and Deacon sat together on the porch steps, while Sophie and Tucker ran wild in the yard, chasing lightning bugs that had just started blinking on as the sky faded from blue to orange to a soft, bruised purple. The porch was Tank's finest work, wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a little table between them, though tonight Emily and Deacon sat side by side on the top step instead, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Tucker told his teacher I was his uncle, Deacon said, turning his cup of sweet tea slowly in his hands. Guess word's out. Emily smiled, watching Tucker leap after a firefly, missing it by a mile, giggling anyway. He's not wrong. No, Deacon said quietly. Guess he's not. The sun kept sinking, throwing long gold light across the yard, catching the swing set chains and making them glow like something out of a picture book. Sophie shrieked with laughter as she finally caught a firefly in her cupped hands, running over to show her brother the tiny glowing light trapped between her fingers before letting it go free into the darkening air. Emily watched them both, her heart so full it almost hurt. 3 months ago, she couldn't have imagined a night like this. Couldn't have imagined feeling safe enough to just sit still and breathe. Beside her, Deacon shifted. She felt it before she saw it. The small movement of his hand leaving his cup and settling instead on the step between them. Then his fingers found hers, slow and careful, like he was giving her every chance in the world to pull away if she wanted to. She didn't. Her hand turned into his, fingers curling around his rough, calloused palm, and neither of them said a word. The yard kept ringing with the kids' laughter. The fireflies kept blinking on and off in the tall grass at the edge of the trees. The sky kept fading toward night, streaked with the last warm colors of the day. Emily looked over at Deacon, and he was already looking at her, that same steady, quiet look he always gave her, like he had all the time in the world and wasn't in any hurry to rush a single second of it. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Neither one of them said anything at all. They didn't need to. A year to the day. Deacon stood beside his motorcycle in the early morning light, running his hand along the worn leather seat the way he always did before a ride. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, the same way it had that first morning when he'd turned on to Miller's Creek Trail, not knowing what waited for him at the end of it. Back then, he'd made this ride alone every month, a habit born from grief, a way of keeping Mikey close even though Mikey was gone. He'd ride the trail slow, remembering the sound of his brother's laugh, the way Mikey used to lean his bike into the curves like he owned the whole forest. It had always been a quiet ride, a sad one. Today felt different before he even started the engine. He swung his leg over the bike and settled into the seat, feeling the familiar rumble build beneath him as he turned the key. The sound of the engine used to feel like the only voice that understood his grief. Now it just felt like the sound of going home. He pulled out of his own driveway and onto the road, taking the long way toward Miller's Creek the same way he always had. The morning sun slanted through the trees, throwing stripes of gold and shadow across the cracked pavement. He passed the gas station where he used to stop for coffee before these rides, the diner where Emily now worked mornings, the turnoff that led toward the old logging road. When he reached the trailhead, he paused for a moment, the way he always did. He remembered the minivan sitting there a year ago, door hanging open, a child's shoe abandoned in the mud. He remembered the fear that had gripped him then, the instinct that told him something was wrong, someone needed help. He eased the bike onto the trail and let the memory settle into something softer than it used to be. Not gone, just changed. The ache was still there, the same way it would probably always be there, tucked somewhere behind his ribs where Mikey lived. But it didn't hurt the way it used to. It felt more like carrying a photograph in his pocket than a wound that never closed. The trail wound through the trees the same way it always had, roots and rocks bumping beneath his tires, branches arching overhead like a tunnel made of green light. He passed the spot where the cabin's chimney first came into view a year ago, smoke curling weak and gray against a cold sky. Today there was no smoke, just the porch, freshly painted white, catching the morning sun. And there they were. Sophie stood at the porch rail, hair pulled back in a ponytail that bounced when she caught sight of him, already waving both arms over her head like she was trying to flag down an airplane. Tucker was down in the yard, crouched by the edge of the driveway with a stick in his hand, drawing something in the dirt. Probably an engine. Probably something with pistons and wheels that only made sense in a 5-year-old's imagination. Emily stood in the doorway. She had one hand resting on the frame, the morning light catching the side of her face, turning her hair gold at the edges. She wasn't waving. She was just watching him come up the trail the way she always did, like she still couldn't quite believe he kept showing up, and like she was grateful every single time that he did. Deacon slowed the bike as he turned into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath his tires, the engine settling into a low, easy idle before he cut it off completely. The quiet that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of bird song and the distant creek and Tucker's stick scratching against the dirt and Sophie's sneakers pounding down the porch steps. "Uncle Deacon!" Tucker hollered, dropping his stick and sprinting across the yard, arms already outstretched. Sophie wasn't far behind him, laughing, her ponytail flying loose behind her. Deacon swung off the bike and caught them both at once, one arm around each of them, lifting them half off the ground while they laughed into his shoulders. Over their heads, he found Emily's eyes. She was smiling at him, warm and steady, the same way the porch light used to glow through the cabin window on the coldest nights. The trail behind him had once led to grief. Now it led here, to this, to them, to home. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.